remember sitting in class. I was in 4th or 5th grade and we were learning something about American history. Could have been the Great Depression or the War of 1812, when it dawned on me suddenly. None of what we were learning about in class had anything to do with queer history. I knew people like me had to exist in the world, so there must have been queer people in history too, right? But in the history we learned about, I didn't see any gay people. It made me feel like the odd one out, like it didn't belong. It made me wonder if queer history wasn't worth teaching, and it gave me the overwhelming feeling it was something too inappropriate to be talked about in school. At the time, I didn't know schools teaching queer history was a huge political issue. I also didn't know that other underrepresented communities were fighting for their stories to be told, or that people were fighting against them just as hard. All I knew was I could feel the gap. I knew people like me had to exist in history, and yet neither them nor their contributions ever showed up in the lessons I was taught. So I knew I needed to teach myself. The problem was, I didn't know how. I wasn't a historian or a researcher. I didn't know where to look, how to tell good information from bad, or even really what I was looking for. Googling queer history can only get you so far, especially when that's all you know to look for. After a lot of trial and error, learning to tell if a source was credible or not, and brute forcing my way to information, I taught myself the history that wasn't in the curriculum. I learned about Alan Turing, the man who laid the foundation for computer science and artificial intelligence. He was a gay man whose genius could have accomplished so much more, had he not overdosed on cyanide pills prescribed to him for homosexuality. That side of the story doesn't seem to get talked about as much. I learned about Stonewall, which is a 6-day-long riot that is credited with kicking off the movement for lesbian and gay rights. That sounds fairly important to the rest of American history, right? But you'll never see it brought up in any lesson on protests. There are thousands of other people and events like this. Bayard Rustin, Emilio Robles Avila, Kelly Peterson, Ma Rainey. It seemed like the reason their contributions weren't talked about wasn't because they weren't important, but because of their queerness. But they shouldn't be dismissed because of that. Their story deserves to be told just as much as anybody else's. This is not an issue that affects only academia. Only 36.4% of LGBTQ+ students were taught any sort of representation of LGBTQ+ history, positive or negative. The rest were never taught anything at all. An entire part of history that is completely ignored, despite the fact that not learning about it has very real and very negative effects. There are harsh consequences to this lack of representation. It leads to ignorance, which perpetuates intolerance and prejudice. It's really easy to make fun of what you don't understand, what you never learned about. I know that changing school curriculum is hard and takes a lot of work, but that's not what I'm asking. Until the day comes that school curriculum is updated, teach yourself, learn the history of marginalized people, and try to understand why their contributions matter. In the same study by the Gay, Lesbian, and Straight Education Network, 60% of LGBTQ+ students don't feel safe in school because of their sexual orientation. But it was found that LGBTQ+ inclusive material and education help make kids feel more comfortable. And of course it did. It makes them feel like they belong, and it can make other students better at accepting queer and trans kids as well. When something is talked about, when it's taught, it makes it less unknown. It makes it less feared and harder to hate. That's why it's so important that you teach yourself this history. The more people that know something, the better the world becomes. So please, learn the history that school doesn't teach us. These stories are important, and telling these stories is important. Even when all the students in one class look alike, they are very different, each unique. But our history tends to reflect a particular shade and heritage. Learn the history of the people whose stories have been silenced for years. Do it for the people that feel like the odd one out, and for yourself, who deserves to learn and understand something you were never taught. Thank you.